right? Thanking and praising God for the way that he helps us build or even restore a good reputation. Let's call Acts chapter 28, the last chapter in the book, unusual kindness, in the way that they are received after shipwreck on the island of Malta. In this chapter that starts out in the first 6 verses, helping us to understand that they have arrived on land, but they eventually discover that the land they have arrived on is called the island of Malta, where the residents showed them unusual kindness, helping them to build a fire. And even though things are starting well, understanding all of the hardship behind them as they build a fire, things are not going to seem to let Paul get a break, as a snake is going to jump out of the pile of wood and clamp on his hand, causing these unusually kind people to believe that justice must have caught up with Paul, because in surviving the shipwreck, the snake wouldn't let him get away. But after they see him shake the snake off into the fire and they observe him for a while and realize nothing happens, they're going to flip and think he's a god. And if they thought that was something, it is only going to continue, or they're going to continue to have reason to think well of Paul. In verses 7 through 10, is one of their chiefs, a man by the name of Publius, is going to meet Paul, but he is going to have a problem because his father is sick. But Paul is going to be able to heal his father, and not just his father once word gets out. So we've seen throughout the book of Acts, he is going to be able to heal many others on that island. And so the way in which they were shown unusual kindness as they arrived on Malta is going to be met, or it's going to come full circle with the way that they are sent off well by the people of Malta, as verses 11 through 16 help us to see that they left Malta after spending 3 months there. And after that 3 months, they make their way to Syracuse, where after 3 days, he is going to meet with the brothers on Syracuse before making his way on to Rome, where once again, it seems that Paul has made enough of an impression on those around him, even those overseeing him, that they are simply going to leave him alone with a simple soldier to oversee or look after him, as he is going to meet with the brothers at Rome, seeming to mean the brothers who are already believers in Christ at Rome. Understanding that he is not done, he has some witnessing to do. Verses 17 through 22 are going to show that beyond the brothers who are already believers at Rome, he is going to gather together the leaders of the Hebrews at Rome. And as he explains why he is there in custody, they are going to say that they have not heard ill of him, but they have heard shady or suspect reports about the way, or the way of Christ. Understanding that, they are going to appoint a time to hear Paul further. And in verses 23 through 28, they are going to assemble on the day that they have designated to hear Paul, at which point he is going to take them through the scriptures that, along with recent events, prove that Jesus is the Christ. And as we've seen throughout not only Christ's ministry, but throughout the rest of the book of Acts, the truth that he is able to tell them is going to persuade some, but not everyone, as Christ said he came to bring not peace, but a sword. And even in this last chapter of the book of Acts, in the very final verses, we're going to see the words of Christ have that very same effect, as some amongst the brethren of the Hebrews in Rome are going to believe, others not so much, leading Paul to quote Isaiah in much the same way Christ did, foretelling the way in which their ability to see and hear and understand the truth with their hearts is going to be diminished to the point where he is simply going to turn to others who will listen. With that, Paul is going to say that the Gentiles indeed will listen, as the entire book of Acts ends up in verses 30 through 31, recording the way that for 2 whole years, Paul stayed there at his own expense, speaking boldly to those who would listen. In some ways, reminiscent of the way he was received by those on the island of Malta, who, as we titled the chapter, were known for their unusual kindness, and reminded me of, among others, the Bereans, who were known for being noble in the way that they diligently searched the scriptures to see if the things that Paul was saying were true, reminding me of others like the first deacons we saw in chapter 6 who were noticeably trustworthy enough that both sides of a dispute, as we have mentioned, trusted them to administrate fairly the things of the church as the apostles turned their attention back to teaching and preaching and making sure the word got out. And beyond that, there are many others I'm probably not thinking of. One more comes to mind. Well, as one of those deacons, we believe it's the same Philip who was one of the 7 in Acts chapter 6, as he goes on in chapter 8 to speak to the Ethiopian eunuch. He was one who was humble enough to say, and when Philip challenged him, do you understand what you're reading? A high official like that didn't have to admit his weakness, but he said, how can I if I don't have someone to teach me? And so even though we have a great number of examples of those who had good character, who allowed themselves to be perfected by the things that God was going to bring them through the apostles, likewise, we have examples of men like Paul, who, much like some of the people he is seeing here in Rome, wasn't always willing to listen to the things the apostles had to say. And so he gives us a contrast between those who were being perfected or having their reputations perfected by the counsel of God and those who were having their reputations rehabilitated by the counsel of God. Understanding that I recently had the chance to talk to a brother about the importance of legacy. The last chapter of Acts, in connection with that conversation, reminds me of the way that God gives us a chance to have him counsel us in the ways of establishing a legacy we don't have to be ashamed of, one that isn't constrained by what we have been and isn't dependent upon being exceptionally skilled, understanding that Paul was an exceedingly skilled man with a suspect reputation who, by the end of the book of Acts, had allowed God to develop his character to the point where he became an exceedingly skilled man with an exceedingly great reputation, which is why at every skill level, we sometimes say, my prayer for you is my prayer for me. God, please help us appreciate the way in which developing a great character is key to developing a great legacy.